Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first lecture in interpersonal communication, Communication 5. So, I will be doing these lectures that correlate with the chapters basically each week in this class, and you can find out in each weekly module which chapter you need to be reading, and then that'll correlate to the lecture that I'll be doing. And it really helps if you have that course packet that I told you to go get from CopyMax. If you don't have the packet right now, you'll survive, but it's just easier because I would highly suggest that you take notes. So if you have the course packet, you're going to want to turn in that course packet to page 21, or it should be someplace close to page 21. And it'll say Chapter 1, Communication Basics, and you will see a bunch of terms and kind of skeleton style lecture notes. So as I lecture and you'll see PowerPoint, you should be taking notes as if you were in class. And I will tell you that our 3 exams are going to be open notes. So the better notes you've taken during these lectures, the better you're going to do on the exams. And as I said, if you watch the welcome video, your exams are going to be timed. So you don't have an unlimited amount of time to go searching for the answers to the questions. That's why if you have good notes that you've taken from the lecture, that'll help you a lot on the exams. So having the course packet right now, if you don't have it, it's okay. But if you do have it, then I would suggest that you open it to chapter 1 and that you just try to take some notes along with this lecture, just like if you were sitting face to face in class. Okay, so chapter 1, Communication Basics. So the first thing that we're going to cover in this chapter are the needs that communication meets. So if you were to communicate with another person one-on-one, you would be doing so for various reasons or various needs that you may have. First of all, communication meets a physical need. So it's interesting to talk about this right now in light of what's going on in the world with our quarantine and social distancing, because there is heavy research to show that humans need to connect and interact with other humans. And if we don't interact with other humans, it is actually bad for our physical health. So there is a study that has been done, and the study was done a while ago, but it's a pretty famous study because of the findings, that people who lack strong relationships are 3 times more likely to have an early death compared to people who didn't or don't have strong relationships. And that was regardless whether the people with strong relationships smoked or drank alcohol or exercised. So the factor they were looking at is how important it is to have social connections with people. Now this is interesting. Another study. Socially isolated people are 4 times more susceptible to getting the common cold compared to people who have active social networks. Now, one would think that if you're being isolated, you're not going to get a cold because you're not going to get any germs. But what this study found is that your immunity needs the emotional connection with people to be stronger. And there is so much the downside of not having social networks with people. The downside outweighs the positive benefits of not having the germs exposure. So in light of what's happening right now with all of us staying home and trying to distance and quarantine, it's just an interesting finding. And all of us need to remember that you do need to maintain your social relationships with people. And we're all learning different ways to do that right now, through social media and the internet and, Zoom and phone calls and staying 6 feet apart, all that stuff, which we're not here to talk about. But the point is, you need social interaction for your physical health. So while you're trying to stay healthy, don't forget about the people who matter to you and stay connected to those people. Okay. It also meets an identity need. So we will be talking about this in next week's lecture quite a bit, that especially as you're growing up, you learn about yourself by messages that you receive from other people. So as you're growing up, people will tell you things about you, like, oh, you're so funny, or you're so clever, you're so creative, you're so artistic. And whatever they are telling you, communicating to you, becomes part of how you see yourself. Oh, I'm clever, I'm creative, I'm artistic. So it continues on as we're all adults. People continue to tell us things about us, and that's how we learn about who we are. So it's kind of like seeing yourself through someone else's lens. And again, this is kind of like a big topic of next week's lecture, so I'm not going to say much more right now. Then the obvious one is that we need communication for a social purpose, right? So the main way that relationships are created and maintained is through communication. And think about, we talked about it's good for your physical health, but also think about your emotional well-being. Think about what makes your life meaningful. And I would say that one thing that really makes your life meaningful are the relationships that you have with people that you're close to, that you care about. Think about when you get good news, something happens to you that you're excited about. What do you want to do right away when you get that good news? Don't you want to let someone know right away, and not just some stranger on the street, but you want to like call someone, text someone who you care about because you want to share that news? And it's almost as if the news isn't real until you've shared it, right? So our interpersonal relationships give our lives meaning. Then there's a practical need to communicate. So, I don't know when you're watching this lecture, but if you just think about what you've done so far, even in this day, you probably had to communicate with someone just for a practical reason. For example, if you went and bought a coffee someplace and now you could have done it online, but if you went and asked, where is the coffee? Or I'd like to order a grande frappuccino. Those are reasons of just practical needs, right? You needed a coffee, so you communicated with someone. You asked someone how to get somewhere. You called tech support because you were having trouble with Canvas. So a lot of us every day are just communicating just for practical reasons. And you could even do that with someone with whom you're close. So I communicated with my daughter this morning that I needed a piece of paper. So she gave me a piece of paper. So the only purpose of that communication was to get the piece of paper that I needed. It was just a practical reason. So these interchange and overlap. So sometimes you can be really close to someone and just communicate with them for a practical reason. And we're going to talk more about that later in this lecture. So these are the different needs that communication meets. So now we move on to the model of communication. And if you have a course packet, you will see probably like on page 22 or 23, there's this kind of funky diagram that's empty. In this lecture for this semester, just skip that, throw that away, use it for scratch paper, recycle it. I'm not going to go over that diagram. You're not responsible for the diagram. But then you see a list of terms, and those terms you are responsible for understanding. And those are the terms I'm going to be explaining right now. So this is what happens when one person is communicating with another person. So it's a model of like what happens or the process of communication. Okay, so this is what you want to take notes, right? On page 21 of your packet if you have it. So we have an encoder. The encoder would be the person who sends a message. So in this class, we're all about the sending of messages. The encoder thinks of a symbol to represent whatever's going on in their head. So in your head, when you're with another person, you have ideas and thoughts and feelings and opinions. You want to express those to this other person. You've got to come up with the proper symbol to represent that thought so you can express yourself, right? What do we call these symbols that you use to express yourself if you're having a conversation with someone? Words. So we're going to talk another chapter about how words are just symbols of all these things, of ideas and thoughts. So you come up with a symbol to represent whatever's in your head that you want to express to someone else. The message is any verbal or nonverbal stimulus that is meaningful to a receiver. So the receiver is on the other side of the encoder. The receiver is the same thing as a decoder. So any verbal, and we'll talk in a second about what's verbal and what's nonverbal, but anything that the receiver or the decoder notices that is meaningful to them from you as the encoder, that's the message. So it's like whatever you are sending as the encoder. You could be sending a verbal message, a nonverbal message. You could be sending a message intentionally or unintentionally. And we'll be talking about this as the semester goes along, that I might say something and I might send a message to you that you misinterpret. Or I might just look at you a certain way and I send you a message that you misinterpret. So messages can be sent intentionally and unintentionally. Two types of messages that I just kind of touched on. You can have a verbal message or a non-verbal message. Okay, so all of these terms are in your notes, right? First of all, we'll talk about a verbal message. A verbal message uses language. So there are rules, there is formality, there is some type of a formal linguistic code. That's what's important to understand about a verbal message. There is a formal, rule-generated, rule-governed, formal linguistic code. Okay, now we branch out and talk about two types of verbal messages. You have verbal vocal, which means there's a formal linguistic code and you're using your voice. Like when you're talking to someone with words, spoken language is an example. So spoken language is not the definition of verbal vocal, but it's an example. So just think vocal means using your voice. Verbal means what it says right there that I just talked about, use of language. Then there is verbal non-vocal, which means you're using a formal linguistic code, but you're not using your voice. Can you think of an example? Using a formal linguistic code, but not using your voice. Where'd my example go? There we go. For example, sign language, written language, Morse code. So in all those examples, again, you're not using your voice, you're sending a message utilizing a formal linguistic code. So if you've taken a sign language class, you know that it's very rule governed, right? Obviously, our written language, lots of rules. Any English class you've ever gone to, they give you all the rules about proper English. And Morse code, there's a code, formal linguistic code. Okay, so all of these are verbal messages. So you can have either vocal, using your voice, or you send a message with a formal linguistic code without your voice. Moving on to nonverbal messages. So nonverbal messages are messages sent without a formal linguistic code. And we have nonverbal, non-vocal. So you're sending a message without your voice, without a formal linguistic code. So your gestures can send a message. If I'm really mad at you and I'm telling you, why haven't you bought the course packet? Why? And I'm using my gestures. That sends you a message, right? My body language. If I were to do the whole lecture, I don't know if you can see me, the whole lecture like this. Or, you know what I'd really like to do is do the whole lecture like this. Can you imagine if I did the whole lecture like this? My feet up. Hello. Okay. There. Now you know I'm wearing shorts. Oh, darn it. Okay. Yeah, I'm wearing shorts. I'm like the newscasters that wear shorts. Anyway, I'd be sending you a message, right? So I can send a message with my body language, my gestures, my facial expressions. If I did the whole lecture like this, I'd send you a message, right? So sending a message using everything but your voice, your body language, your face. Then we have nonverbal vocal. So you're sending a message without a formal linguistic code, but your voice is involved. So your tone of voice sends a message. You know what I mean? So if I say, thanks to you, or if I say thanks, that sends a totally different message because of my tone, right? So tone of voice, we all know that sends a message. Laughing, crying sends a message. There's no formal language code with laughing or crying, but you're definitely using your voice, definitely sending a message. Okay, then we have the decoder. And it doesn't say on this PowerPoint, but it should say the decoder is the same one as the receiver. So you have an encoder, who is the sender, who sends a message to the decoder, who is also the receiver, which is the same thing. And this is the person who notices and translates your message, whether your message is a verbal message or a nonverbal message. They notice and translate the message. Okay, a frame of reference is the sum total of a person's knowledge, experiences, goals, values, and it should also say attitudes. Sorry, it doesn't say attitudes, but it should say attitudes. The sum total of a person's knowledge, experiences, goals, values, and add the word attitudes. What does that mean? That means that when I'm talking to you, I have knowledge, experiences, goals, values, and attitudes. And you have knowledge, experiences, goals, values, and attitudes. Oops, sorry. Backing up. So, is it ever possible that my frame of reference will be the exact same frame of reference as another person who I'm talking to? Is that a possibility? Not a possibility. No two people can have the exact same frame of reference by definition. No two people share the exact same knowledge, experiences, goals, values, and attitudes. So when you're communicating with another person, that's something you need to always remember, that whatever you know and believe and feel about something will always be different from the other person. And you might be really similar to another person. That's awesome. That's great. But obviously, you have differences. And some of those differences at times can lead to communication issues because you assume what's in your head and they assume what's in their head, and that it doesn't always match up. Or you meant something and they took it a different way, but that's not the way you meant it. So you see what I mean? That's why we have these communication problems at times, is because we all have a different frame of reference. And often we forget that. We just sort of assume everyone thinks like us and is like us and knows what we mean. You know, we say that a lot, right? Oh yeah, you know. Well, no, I don't know. Whenever someone says, yeah, I know. What do you mean you know? How do you know? How do I know that you know? Okay. Feedback is any discernible response to a received message. So if I'm the encoder and I'm sending you a message and you roll your eyes at me, you just sent me a message. Obviously a non-verbal, non-vocal message. Maybe you just had something in your eye and your eyes were kind of rolling back at the moment. But if I interpreted that as, oh, you're bored with me, or you think I'm silly what I'm saying, that you've sent me feedback. So feedback can be just like a message, verbal or non-verbal, intentional or unintentional. Now, when you are rolling your eyes at me and sending me a message as the decoder, you just transformed yourself into what? The encoder, right? So if you're rolling your eyes, you're sending me a message, and that's what the encoder does. They send messages. So we call this the transactional view of communication, which is that we send and we receive messages simultaneously. So in this class, when we study communication, we will isolate encoder, decoder, sender, receiver. But in real life, it's the same thing, because when I'm talking to you and you're sending me feedback in an interpersonal situation, then that's the transactional view, because when you send me that feedback, you become the encoder. So when you're face to face with someone or face to Zoom with someone, you are sending and receiving messages simultaneously. Okay, I'm going to stop here because my video is getting to be 20 minutes and that's where they said I should cut it. So part 2 of this video will start with this slide. So end of part 1. I'll see you in a second.